You should be able to see a green screen, hopefully in front.
Yep.
Okay, good, thanks. I need that feedback. I've got to know that people are out there. Okay, so let's talk about endocrine pathology. We're all pretty comfortable with endocrine normal function, and I'm sure that some of you have hormones as your signaling molecule for the assignment. So you'll be particularly comfortable with those particular topics. Let's see, we still got people arriving. That's fine. That's good. So when we look at endocrine diseases or endocrine pathologies, basically it's too much or it's too little of the signaling molecule, in this case, the hormone. Remember that the endocrine system is not really a system hard and fast like the cardiovascular system or the respiratory or digestive system. It's really a series of tissues spread out through the body that operate in a similar way in terms of their mechanisms of delivery to receptors. And that is basically a group of cells in one part of the body produces a signaling molecule, delivers it to the circulatory system, technically any circulating system, but most often it's going to be blood, and then targets tissues or cells at a distant site somewhere else. Now, in some cases, we can sort of subcategorize hormones as paracrine or autocrine, in which case the target is either the same cell in the case of an autocrine or a cell very close to the cells that produce that particular messenger, a paracrine. But typically when we talk about endocrine, we're traveling a bit of a distance. So generally speaking, the endocrine system and the nervous system are responsible for responding to a variety of stimuli and attempting to maintain homeostasis, which we've defined a bunch of different ways, but essentially is keeping biological values between upper and lower limits the most efficient way possible. And that typically allows us to operate in the most efficient way possible. So if we end up with hyper or hypo functioning of any of these hormones, then by definition, we have a pathology. So the scenario for too much or too little is going to be a change in the concentration of the hormone in the blood. So there's too much or too little circulating, or there's a decrease or increase in responsiveness at the targets. In other words, receptor abnormalities. So, for example, we know that in type 1 diabetes, associated with a percentage of those, sorry, not type 1, but type 2 diabetes, a percentage of those who are obese have a correlated reduced sensitivity of insulin receptors. So we know that obesity has a tendency to reduce the sensitivity of receptors to insulin, and that promotes hyperglycemia. So in the endocrine system, the diagnosis is going to be based on the signs and symptoms and the blood tests, literally measuring the levels of these hormones circulating in the blood. Because the glands themselves are often in kind of remote or difficult places to examine. Most of these glands tend to be very vascular, so they'll bleed very easily. They're very vascular for obvious reasons. That's going to be our delivery mode, so we want lots of blood vessels associated with the glands that are producing those messengers. And in the endocrine system, you might remember that we had a direct connection to the nervous system. And that was a connection between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. And that pituitary gland may release hormones that have another target somewhere else. So when we look at pathologies, so we'll just write down a ubiquitous gland in here, not worry about a specific name just yet. But when we talk about pathologies associated with the endocrine system, they can be described as primary endocrine disorders, or they could be described as secondary endocrine disorders. And if they were primary, what we're looking at is there's a problem with the gland responsible for that particular hormone. So, for example, the thyroid gland or the adrenal gland has a particular problem. And if the source of the pathology is that gland, it's described as being a primary endocrine pathology. If we go back one pathway, then if it's a problem with pituitary function, the gland itself may be perfectly functional and doing everything it's supposed to do, but it's not getting the correct signaling from the pituitary gland. That would be described then as a secondary. And we could have technically tertiary, but usually if it's hypothalamic or pituitary, it would be described as being secondary. If it's not the primary gland that's pathologic, then it's behind it in the pathway, it would be described as secondary. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's take a look at our first hormone, other than the one we spent time talking about last week, which was insulin. So we're going to talk about growth hormone. And I can't remember, but I'm pretty sure somebody, or maybe a group of two, has this hormone as a topic. So we might be helping you. You might be able to provide us with some more details if it's not detailed enough for you by the time we're finished talking about it. So the more technical name for the growth hormone, and often we designate it with an H in front of it for human growth hormone, is somatotropin or somatotrophic hormone. But soma is body and trophic means promotes growth, or is anabolic, another way to think of it. So that's what we're dealing with when we talk about this growth hormone. And we know that it is produced where? Anybody? There's your answer. So you might recall, and you're going to want to recall, that the communication between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary gland is a vascular one, which means that the pituitary gland is technically releasing chemical messengers, which we might actually refer to as hormones. But these would be of a paracrine nature because they travel a very short distance. But for example, the signaling molecule that is released from the hypothalamus is called the growth hormone releasing hormone. Growth hormone releasing hormone. Or you might see it as growth hormone stimulating hormone. But either way, that's what's being produced by special neurons in the hypothalamus that signal the anterior pituitary gland to release growth hormone. And then growth hormone, when it's released, is going to target the liver. And I'm really quite sure that there's a couple of people in the class that know what happens next. Who can tell me what's going to be released from the liver in response to the growth hormone targeting that liver? There's at least two people that should be able to answer this question right away. And I'm assuming that one of them is here. Anybody? Am I talking to myself, or are there people out there that can hear me?
No, I have no idea what happens.
We can hear you.
Okay. Insulin-like growth factors, IGFs. And they are just what they sound like. Structurally, they look a little bit like insulin. And like insulin, they tend to be anabolic. And the insulin-like growth factors come in a few categories. But insulin-like growth factor number 1 is probably the one that is spread throughout most of the body and targets most cells in the body to promote amino acid anabolism, in other words, protein synthesis, and promote lipolysis, so breakdown of fats. And these things together give one of the functions that growth hormone is often credited with, which is the production of lean body mass. So it's also sometimes been nicknamed the youth drug, because people realize that as you get older, you have a little more trouble with lipolysis and a little more trouble with maintaining your, say, ideal weight, and you start to deposit fats a little easier. And if you administer a little bit of extra growth hormone, then you can develop that lean body mass a little more effectively. The problem was historically that if you were taking human growth hormone for vanity purposes, you were taking it away from people who might have a legitimate deficiency. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we look at some treatments. So we're talking about this insulin-like growth factor that actually is the messenger that targets most cells in the body to promote this anabolism of proteins and lipolysis of adipose tissue. And those things will then promote gluconeogenesis because of the free fatty acids that are made available from the lipolysis. And that in turn increases blood glucose. So that's essentially what we're thinking of when we look at the basic functions of somatotropin. Now, it's regulated from the hypothalamus unless we're into unique situations like a tissue repair situation or something along those lines. And that's because the hypothalamus can also release something called growth hormone inhibiting hormone. So when there's a demand for more growth hormone, we get the releasing hormone. When the circulating levels of growth hormone are at or close to their peak, then we release the inhibiting hormone, and we create a cycle based on that. And basically, when these functions are optimal, they act as a negative feedback loop to the hypothalamus, and that's when the inhibiting hormone would be released. Okay, now we mentioned that the pathologies are pretty straightforward. So we can have a situation here where we have a decrease in available growth hormone. We know it's produced in the anterior pituitary gland, released on stimulus from the releasing hormones in the hypothalamus, targets most tissues in the body, promotes all those things. So if we have a situation where there's a decrease in growth hormone, there's 3 possibilities. 3 mechanisms. We can be producing, I should say secreting, decreased growth hormone secretions. We could have a situation where we have decreased growth hormone effectiveness. Actually, a better word than efficiency is efficacy. And it's just saying that growth hormone is there, but it's not very effective. So it's probably an IGF problem or a receptor problem. And our third mechanism is that we have abnormal somatometers, which is the other word for the IGFs. So that would be those IGFs are going to be produced in the liver. And so if there's some sort of an enzyme issue in the liver or a pathology directly affecting liver function, then we may have a problem with IGF production and delivery. So in adults, it's going to be pretty tough to diagnose. It's just going to be difficult. It's sometimes being insidious because the most obvious influence of growth hormone is your overall height. And if you've already reached your mature skeletal size and then acquire a growth hormone deficiency, it's not going to be terribly noticeable. But it could occur, and it may occur due to trauma or a tumor. In endocrine pathologies, the tumors can be a cause of too much or too little. In some cases, these tumors will be of the cells that are responsible for producing a hormone, in which case we'd have too much. And in other cases, you've got an adjacent group of cells that have become tumorous, and they choke off or crowd out the cells that are responsible for producing the hormone we're looking at, in this case, growth hormone. So it's not a tumor of the cells producing growth hormone, it's a tumor of adjacent cells to the cells that produce growth hormone that would result in a deficiency. So what would happen, which would be pretty subtle in adults, is there would be a decrease in lean body mass. There maybe would be an increase in circulating cholesterol, decrease in bone density. And again, going to be difficult to differentiate that as a growth hormone problem unless we actually directly measure the growth hormone that's circulating in the blood altogether. And occasionally there's a little bit of an increased mortality rate due to cardiovascular disease, but in children, it's much more significant. So in children, the issue is going to be delayed growth. Growth hormone, no growth hormone, delayed growth should seem pretty intuitive, pretty obvious. The key thing here is that they're going to be short proportion. And it's described as pituitary dwarfism. So they don't have that disproportionate skeleton that is a more common type of dwarfism. That one is called achondroplastic dwarfism, and that's a genetic abnormality that results in the axial skeleton being pretty close to a normal length and size, and the proximal parts, especially of the limbs, the lower limbs and the upper limbs, are short. So you get a disproportionate dwarfism in those individuals. In this case, short but proportional is defining pituitary dwarfism. So the big issue is that there's very little or inadequate levels of amino acid synthesis. So you're going to get decreased bone mass, you're going to get decreased muscle mass, you get delayed teeth disruption, thin hair, poor nail growth, all things that you would associate with a protein synthesis in these individuals. Blood vessels will be, more easily broken, fractured, bleeding, hemostasis, that sort of thing. And the treatment then is going to be much like type 1 diabetes. It's replacement. And back in the day, human growth hormone was going to be derived from cadaver pituitary glands. It sounds a little bit morbid, but where else are you going to get human growth hormone except from another human? And living humans aren't going to give it up, and nor should they. So back, relatively speaking, not all that long ago, the human growth hormone was limited to the availability that could be harvested from cadavers. And of course, there's a risk with that. Anybody have any idea what the risk could be? If you're harvesting
Can you cause like necrosis or something? Sepsis?
Well, no, because that can be monitored, and the human growth hormone can be, I'm using quotation marks that you can't see, but washed so that it's not so much that it would cause an infection or that sort of a problem. But if the tissue, at least from a transplant point of view, but if the tissue is already infected, if you remember back when we talked about the principles of infection, we talked about these prions. And these prions in humans create a condition called Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, which is otherwise known as mad cow disease in cows. And those prions can't be easily detected in the tissue. So there was a risk that when you transplanted a human growth hormone sample from a cadaver, that you might be transplanting these prions at the same time. So that's a concern. But now it's not so much a concern, because just like insulin, we can make recombinant human growth hormone. So with recombinant human growth hormone, we are able to make the human growth hormone, the sequence of amino acids for that particular hormone in a laboratory, and multiply it through bacterial growth populations, and get growth hormone from sources other than cadavers. So you remove that risk of Jakob-Creutzfeldt disease, which is a good thing. And it also has made human growth hormone commercially available. People like to refer to it as a youth drug, or the drug of the rich and famous, because a lot of rich and famous people think that if they take regular shots of human growth hormone, they start to look more youthful, because they start to develop more of that lean body mass appearance, as opposed to a typical aging body, as far as that goes. So anyway, the pituitary dwarfs that need this replacement typically get injections anywhere from 3 to 7 times a week. And the goal of the replacement is to maintain that replacement until they reach skeletal maturity. Because once they've reached skeletal maturity, they're going to get a height. They won't probably reach height that would be considered average. They're probably still going to be a little bit short, because this is an administration. And so it's an artificial determinant of how much growth hormone is in circulation. But it is a solution. And then they'll still receive growth hormone shots in adulthood as well, but not as frequent, because the need after skeletal maturity isn't quite the same. So that's not enough growth hormone, pituitary dwarfism. And the opposite then is what happens if we have too much growth hormone. And we might have a situation where there is a tumor of the cells that produce the growth hormone in the anterior pituitary gland, and that starts to produce growth hormone that stops responding to normal feedback loops. So the result of that would be targeting the liver and producing higher than normal levels of IGFs. And then what we would see is increased growth and both soft tissue and skeletal tissue. So in children, they're going to become giants, because they haven't reached skeletal maturity yet. Those growth plates in their long bones haven't closed off, so they're going to continue to grow in length, and they can grow, up to more than 8 feet in height in some cases. So it's going to be recognized and possibly treated before they get to that height. But in situations where it's not recognized, in places where they don't have access maybe to some of the treatments that the other parts of the world do have, this is what you're going to see. That's what you're going to see as the most obvious sign of excessive growth. The big issue from a life-saving or a life-risking point of view is that you're also going to get soft tissue bone and muscle growth, soft tissue growth, and when it affects the heart, you're going to end up with cardiomegaly. And we know that if the heart increases in size to a certain point, the preload advantage goes away, and instead, what are we going to get? a topic that's very close and dear to your heart right now. You're going to have a test on this for you guys next week. Heart failure. That should be cardiomegaly. Right? Does that make sense? We okay with that?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Now, so that's the biggest issue we're concerned about with children, is that they at a very young age can develop heart failure. In adults, it's going to become obvious as well. Now, in adults, they're not going to get taller because they've already reached skeletal maturity. The condition of excessive growth hormone in an adult is called acromegaly. So you've got mega, so you know things are getting bigger. But we're going to continue to get, because of the protein synthesis, we're going to get hyperplasia of soft tissues and appositional bone growth. You know, when we say appositional bone growth, we're talking about bone growth in thickness, width. So the features where, like fingers and toes and the forehead, for example, gets enlarged, larger than average. You've seen some actors in Hollywood that have acromegaly, and they make a career out of their appearance. They end up, of course, playing monsters or bad guys. In some of the James Bond movies, long before your time, there was a guy named Richard Keel. He was called Jaws in 2 or 3 different James Bond movies, but he was an acromegalic, and he was tall, but he also had just a huge jaw and a huge forehead and huge hands, that sort of thing. And those are the characteristics of someone with acromegaly. So you get an increase in appositional bone growth. But you also get organomegaly. So the organs throughout the body are going to increase in size. And again, just like with our child, if it happens in the heart, we got cardiomegaly. That's going to lead us to heart failure. We might see goiter, which is an increase in the tissue associated with the thyroid gland. Their tongue gets very thick. Some of these people have trouble with enunciation of words because their tongue gets in the way. They also develop glucose intolerance. So this is described as a pituitary diabetes, because the source is not an insulin deficiency or even an insulin mismatch. It has to do with the glucose intolerance that is originating because of a pituitary pathology. So what happens in these individuals is that the prolonged elevated levels of growth hormone promote insulin resistance. So our increased growth hormone gives us our insulin resistance, which results in glucose intolerance. So what we'll do is change that direction of that arrow there. So, and the result is elevated levels of glucose. So we've talked about a hormone here, prolonged elevated levels of glucose, of growth hormone are going to give us hyperglycemia. But we can see the mechanism is a little bit different than what it was with type 1 and type 2 diabetes. This is a pituitary diabetes. So for treatment, if we determine that it's a tumor, then it's going to be a surgery. And then what we can do is replace the naturally released growth hormone with synthetic growth hormone or the recombinant growth hormone. So that's one possibility. That's truly addressing the source. We can administer synthetic somatostatin. So remember, we said that the scientific name for growth hormone was somatotrophin. This is somatostatin. So just like other medications that are designed to lower or stop the function, this would be a medication in this case, although there is a hormone that gets released called somatostatin. In this case, we're using it in synthetic form to be antagonistic to the effects of growth hormone. We okay with that? Does that make some sense? We're following along, okay?
I just had a quick question.
Yep.
Is the same etiology for this as well? Like it would be everything the opposite, like increased growth hormone secretion, increased efficacy, increased abnormal soma.
No, could be. So those were mechanisms that can result in a pathology. Where did we have that on our second? Where did I write efficacy? Second one, maybe, eh? 3 mechanisms. So we can apply these 3 things, well, not the somatostatin part, but basically any of our pathologies. Okay, so if we have, in the case of what you're asking, I think, Anita, is what happens if we have increased growth hormone, like because of oversecretion, which is our tumor, right? Or increased growth hormone efficacy, which arguably would be some sort of an upregulation of growth hormone receptors, but in truth, we'd be talking about IGF receptors. So yes, you can make that argument that we can talk about in the case of excessive levels, either increased secretions or increased efficacy.
Okay, thank you.
That answers your question?
Yes, it does.
Okay, what about this thyroid gland? So the thyroid gland is our classic pathway where we have the hypothalamus, we have the anterior pituitary gland, and then we have the thyroid gland. And the thyroid gland is going to release 2 very, from a functional point of view, similar hormones, T3 and T4, and the 3 and the 4 refer to what? What do the numbers 3 and 4 refer to when we talk about these thyroid hormones?
I don't remember how to pronounce them. Is that what you're asking?
No.
Okay.
What I asked is, what is the 3 referring to? And I just wrote it down.
The tri?
Try what?
Triido dironin?
Yeah, you're working hard. You're working hard, but you have no idea what you're talking about, right?
Yeah, no, unfortunately, this is my weak subject, so I am paying attention.
Okay, so listen, here's a very important thing that everybody should recall from when they took this in HAP 101. Now, I don't know who you took it with, but hopefully you had a discussion about iodine. Iodine is an atom that we require in our diet in pretty minute amounts, but without it, we're going to die. The iodine that we get from our diet is required to synthesize thyroid hormones. for every molecule of T3, we need 3 iodine molecules. And for every iodine, or for every molecule of T4, how many do you think we need?
4.
4. So without it, we can't make thyroid hormone. So inside the thyroid gland, it makes this, there's these little follicular cells. And follicular cells, just like follicular cells found in other places, like the ovary, they make up a follicle, which is basically an enclosed space. And inside that space is almost like a gel-like product that's being produced by these cells. They're going to make something called thyroglobulin. And thyroglobulin is a molecule that is of no use to us unless we add some iodine to it. So we're going to transport iodine from the blood because we ate it, and we're going to transport it across the follicular cells into the center of the follicle and add it to thyroglobulin. When we add 3 molecules, we create triiodothyronine. And when we add 4, we get thyroxine. Functionally, they're very similar. Some travel as T3 and are going to match up with receptors throughout the body that recognize T3. And T4 travels throughout the body in a little bit more of a sort of stable form, for lack of a better way to describe it, and drops off an iodine molecule at its target site to become a match with its receptors. So they travel more or less differently, but they act on their targets pretty much identically. And the whole purpose, generally, of T3 and T4 is on almost every cell in the body, there's receptors for the thyroid hormones. There's a few exceptions. The retina and the testes are a couple of examples that are exceptions to the rule. Don't worry about the exceptions to the rule. Remember that most tissues and cells and tissues in the body have receptors for T3 and T4. And when T3, T4 binds to its receptors on these target cells, the general response is an increase in oxygen consumption or transport into cells. So if we increase the oxygen consumption into the cell, what are we doing? What's good? What's the benefit of that? Why do we care about that?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Why do we care? Why do we have a hormone that's dedicated to increasing oxygen transport into cells?
I'm gonna say because you need oxygen for everything to like generate energy and everything.
Okay, so energy is everything. So it's all about the ATP, right? I think you've heard me say this before. It's all about the ATP. If we can increase oxygen delivery to cells, that means we can get the glucose that's become pyruvate to cross the membrane of the mitochondria, and then we can start to manufacture large amounts of ATP. If we manufacture large amounts of ATP, we're going to increase the overall metabolic activity in all these cells. If we target most cells in the body, we're going to increase metabolic activity throughout the organism. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, so and I'm sure, I know that those of you that have taken HAP with me before, you've heard me say this many, many times. I'm sure I've said it this semester too. But if you ever wondered why it is you breathe, it's all about this. There's no other explanation. If you want to talk about the purpose of the respiratory system, it's about delivering oxygen to all the cells in the body. And if we want to be more efficient at that, we're going to have some thyroid hormone available for it. Now, in addition, and of course, the other side of that is to eliminate CO2, but that I'm talking about on this side of it, what we're seeing as a result of the effects of T3 and T4. So with the effects of T3 and T4, we increase metabolic activity, and that's going to increase temperature, because we know that if we make more ATP and use it, we break ATP down to ADP plus the phosphate group, and we get energy, and we get an increase in temperature. Right? So this becomes a thermoregulator as well. Okay, and it promotes overall metabolism. Now we'll see to a point, right? When we get to pathologies, we can see this start to go sideways a little bit, but that's what happens in pathology generally. So when we talk about overall growth and development, we've now mentioned the three major hormones that are responsible for overall growth and development: insulin, growth hormone, and the thyroid hormone. Those are the big three. If you have a deficiency in any one of those, you're going to have a problem with normal growth and development, and by extension, repair. Three majors. Doesn't that sound like a multiple choice question just waiting to happen? So in the thyroid gland, then, again, pathology is very simple. Too much, too little. So what we call too little, hypothyroidism. Okay, and this is where we can talk about it being a primary problem, or if it's back here, a secondary problem. You notice that I put in the pathway TSH and TRH. TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. TRH, thyrotropin releasing hormone. So that's coming from the hypothalamus. And again, because it's going to the anterior pituitary gland, it's a vascular delivery. So this is a hormone. And it's vascular between the anterior pituitary and the thyroid gland. So again, another hormone, TSH. So if it's a pituitary problem or hypothalamic problem, then they would be described as being a secondary pathology. And if it's a direct problem with the thyroid gland, it would be considered primary. Now, a deficiency in iodine would be considered primary as well, because the thyroid gland is failing to produce T3 and T4, in that case, because of a deficiency in a nutrient. So what do we do in North America? North America, especially in the soils around the Great Lakes, are particularly low in iodine. So what did we do as a public health measure to correct that problem, to make sure we get enough iodine in our diet?
Put it in our salt.
We did. We added it to our salt, because most of us here in North America have no trouble getting enough salt. So if we iodinize the salt, we now also have no trouble getting enough iodine. So most common etiology worldwide is a problem with iodine availability. So the most common reason for hypothyroidism worldwide is because of a decrease in available iodine. So you could be born that way because mom didn't provide enough, or it can be acquired through a number of mechanisms. So one of them, we talk about primary acquired. That can happen if, for example, you're diagnosed with hyperthyroidism, and the treatment is going to be to irradiate or surgically remove the thyroid gland. So irradiation. those would be all considered primary acquired pathologies. So again, like I said, the thyroglobulin is still being produced by those follicular cells, but there's no iodine to add to create the actual hormones. Now, what do you think's happening in primary acquired, this one that we just described? What do you think is happening to the TSH in our pathway? So we got low levels of T3, T4 because of a thyroid problem, either no thyroid or partially destroyed thyroid or no iodine. What's the response going to be in our pathway?
Would it increase?
Yeah. So this becomes part of how we diagnose a primary problem versus a secondary problem. So if our problem is hypothyroidism, we know there's a problem with not enough T3, T4. If we work backwards and measure TSH and it's elevated, then by definition, it's going to be a primary hypothyroidism. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, and the same concept applies if we're talking about primary versus secondary in a hyperthyroid situation. So you have to remember where you're starting. So in this situation, we're saying low levels of T3, T4, that's our pathology. And if we are trying to figure out whether it's a problem with the pituitary or the hypothalamus or the thyroid gland, then we can go back and measure TSH. And if TSH is adequate or high, as our example shows here, then we know that it's a primary problem. It's a problem with the thyroid gland because it's getting the signals but not responding effectively. Okay, now we can also have secondary hypothyroidism. Up. In secondary hypothyroidism, we're going to see that the levels of TSH will be low. So that's telling us there's a problem with either the pituitary or the hypothalamus. So the issue with hyper or hypothyroidism is significant, especially in children. And it has a terrible name. Cretinism, which describes a part of the pathology. So again, most commonly due to a decrease in iodine from mom to child in utero, and it gives rise to what we call congenital hypothyroidism. Born with it, not genetic, not the same thing. And that's a good thing because it means that there's a possibility we can reverse it. So if the baby is born with a hypothyroid condition, and they're going to be sluggish, they'll have a thick and protruding tongue. It's very distinct, the appearance. They're not going to feed very effectively, partly because that tongue is blocking the entry point for feeding easily. Decreased muscle tone, decreased heart rate. What do we call decreased heart rate?
Bradycardia.
And here's the trick. Here, I shouldn't say trick. Here's the biggest concern. Mental retardation. Okay, now that some people will say, well, that's not the right term anymore. That's not, but this is literally what we're saying is the mental development is going backwards. It's being slowed down and potentially irreversibly damaged. So that's literally the proper terminology. We're not calling this person mentally retarded. We're saying that their mentality is being interfered with. Their cognition and their mental abilities are being blocked or interfered with. So they talk about this horse cry. That's not horse, that's horse spelled with an O and an A. Not horse like the animal. O-A-R. Yes, I don't know if that was better. So that's very, when a baby's born and they show this thick tongue and this very distinct cry. Sometimes they describe it like a cat cry, like a almost a that sort of wail that a cat can display. So it's very sort of classic as far as that goes. But the key thing here is because it's congenital, because it's from a deficiency of iodine, if it's caught early, then it's reversible. So it's reversible when diagnosed early. And in North America, it's part of a blood test that's done typically right away on a baby, especially if there's any suspicion of, if they came from, say, a part of the countryside or a part of the world where a deficiency in iodine is suspected already, or if the mom has shown signs of hypothyroidism, then this baby's going to be tested automatically. Part of the normal routine blood work done on a newborn baby includes measuring T3 and T4 levels. And if the iodine is administered, and early on maybe even some thyroid hormone is administered, then this mental retardation is reversed, and most of the other signs and symptoms can be reversed. In adults, remember, it's all about that basal metabolic rate. So we're going to see in adults that they have a slower basal metabolic rate. And that might be manifested with weight gain. And again, sluggishness. Lethargy, meaning they just don't feel like they can do anything. This is kind of classic cold intolerance. Remember, we said that when you increase metabolic rate, you increase temperature. So now we have a situation with decreased metabolic rates. We're going to be sensitive to the cold and not have the normal mechanisms available to us to reverse it, because one of the key pathways is the thyroid hormones. They're going to have a poor lipid profile. So they end up with high cholesterol and high triglycerides. And if severe, in an adult, if severe, they can develop what's called mixed edema. Have you guys talked about mixed edema before in another class?
It doesn't sound familiar.
Okay, so this is a very specific type of edema. So it's described as being sort of a generalized, so it could be found anywhere in the soft tissues. Generalized, non-pitting edema. You may notice that in some of your elderly patients with congestive heart failure or chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, that the swelling in their ankles is pitted. It looks sort of lumpy. But this index edema, it's non-pitted. And it's the result of an accumulation of these mucopolysaccharides that collect up in the interstitial spaces. When they collect up in the interstitial spaces, they're going to create an osmotic pull from the cells into the extracellular space. And that can be significant enough to cause coma and death if it isn't reversed, if it isn't corrected. So what do we do with these patients? If it's hypothyroidism, we can replace the thyroid hormones with synthetic. T3, T4. Levothyroxine is one of the categories of synthetic thyroid hormones that are available. And again, that might be required for a short period of time or over a longer period of time, depending on the source of the original problem. If it's an iodine deficiency that can ultimately be corrected, then this synthetic replacement is just going to be a temporary replacement until the dietary intake gets up to speed. Opposite to hypothyroidism, hyperthyroidism. So what's our basic finding in somebody with hyperthyroidism? Whether it's primary, secondary, or tertiary, what's it going to be?
Increase T3 and 4.
It wasn't supposed to be a hard question. It was just supposed to be getting the point, right? Getting comfortable with some of this terminology. So we have a primary scenario. Primary hyperthyroidism is also known as Graves' disease. And this is probably the most common cause of hyperthyroidism. It's not very common, but it is of the causes for hyperthyroidism. This is probably the most common one. We've talked about this one actually in the past. It's an autoimmune pathology. And what happens in Graves' disease is that we make thyroid stimulating immunoglobulins. We start producing thyroid stimulating immunoglobulins, TSIs. And what these antibodies do is they mimic TSH. And if they're mimicking TSH, then they're targeting receptors on the thyroid gland to promote the production of T3 and T4. And because they're antibodies in this case, the antigen is the receptor, and the antibody is the immunoglobulin that's mimicking TSH. So it's antibody mediated. So it's one of the first three types of autoimmune. Remember, we talked about types 1, 2, 3, and 4. And the first three are immunoglobulin mediated, and the fourth one is a tissue or cytotoxic mediation, cell mediated. So that's what happened when beta cells were directly destroyed by the immune system. Those cells were destroyed through cytotoxicity, and no more insulin was being produced. That's a type 4 autoimmune condition. This is a type 2 autoimmune condition. And type 2 was when we had an antibody that was produced against an antigen in the body. So the antigen in this case was the receptor. We get a match and we stimulate the thyroid gland to produce excessive levels of T3 and T4. Secondary hyperthyroidism is going to come from a problem where?
In the anterior pituitary?
Yeah. So what that means is that we're going to be producing excessive levels of TSH. So in our primary condition, we got elevated T3, T4, the TSH levels will be low, because the antibodies are the ones doing the work. So TSH isn't going to work if it doesn't need to. And in fact, the feedback, negative feedback would be lots of T3, T4, so we don't need TSH. But in the case of a secondary condition where we have elevated levels of T3, T4, it's because there's a problem in the pituitary. We went backwards. So in that situation, we've got a tumor, for example, that produces excessive levels of TSH. So what do you think is going to happen in somebody that's got too much thyroid hormone?
Weight loss.
We're going to see everything we wrote down for not enough can be reversed. So we would see weight loss. These people, instead of being lethargic, are going to be agitated. They're going to be irritable. So they're going to tell you that they can't sleep, but they feel tired. But because of the agitation, because of the irritability, they can't get a good night's sleep. They're going to be tachycardic, increased heart rate. They're going to have heat intolerance. They're generating lots of thyroid hormones, so they're going to produce lots of ATP.
They're going to be really sweaty.
They're often going to be very sweaty. And that combination of sweating and increased basal metabolic rates, generally, they're going to be hungry, but they don't put on any weight. In fact, we see the weight loss that's happening. Who knows what's the fancy word for sweating? Anybody know what the fancy word is?
Diaphoresis.
There it is. So we'll throw that in there. Diaphoresis. Okay. And with relatively at least common enough, exophthalmos occurs in a percentage of people with more longer standing hyperthyroidism. And that's a situation where there's an increase in the size of the muscles that are typically holding the eyeball in the socket. So those muscles get increased in size and allow the eyeball to actually protrude. Now, there have been some actors that have become famous because of their ability to bug their eyes out, when in fact they were probably people that were suffering from hyperthyroidism and took advantage of it, if you can call that taking an advantage. But it's very, very distinctive. There was a guy, I can't think of his name right now, who was a fairly successful actor who was famous for those buggy eyes that I'm talking about, and he had hyperthyroidism, so he just took advantage of it as far as that goes. Thyroid issues are going to be more commonly associated with people that have other endocrine issues. So hyperthyroidism is more common in people with type 1 diabetes, for example, but otherwise is still a relatively rare type of presentation. Now, to be aware of something in those that have hyperthyroidism is something called a thyroid storm. And a thyroid storm is life-threatening. And basically what it's referring to is a situation that's described as being thyrotoxicosis. So this is when the elevated levels of the thyroid hormone become so significant, it becomes toxic and life-threatening. So we get a huge T3 and T4 release. And this might occur in someone who's already dealing with hyperthyroidism, and then you add a major stress event to their situation, and that might include like a surgery, something traumatic, or some significant stressor in their life. And what's going to happen is you're going to get this extra surge of T3 and T4 already elevated, and then you add to it. So you're compounding the problem. So we get this extra T3, T4 surge into the circulation. Temperature is going to go way up. Heart rate may become arrhythmic. I don't know if I have all the right letters in there, but you know what I'm getting at there. Dysrhythmias or arrhythmias occurring. I think we need another R in there, something like that. Agitation, psychosis, congestive heart failure are all parts of this puzzle that can happen here. And it's a medical emergency. So this is going to require treatment to address the symptoms straight away. So beta blockers would be applied to try to settle the heart down, and thyroid inhibitors could be applied. And then if it's determined after the fact that the thyroid gland is growing disproportionately, in other words, tumors, there may be a surgery is required to take either part of the thyroid out or all of it out and replace with synthetic thyroid hormones. Okay, now, really, we just need to talk about the adrenal gland and finish with a quick talk on ADH. So probably it makes sense, I think, just to push through, wouldn't you say? Rather than take a break, or would you rather have a break?
We can push through.
Does that work for everybody? I'd say about another half an hour to 40 minutes max.
I'm good pushing.
Okay, good. Yeah, we might as well. And again, it is a recording, so you can stop it and start it at your discretion. So now we want to look at the adrenal gland. So the adrenal gland is literally where it says it is. It's on the kidney, and there's two of them. So we maybe should put a plural in there. And so when we talk about the adrenal glands, then one thing we should just be aware of generally is the adrenal gland, we can generally divide it into a cortex and a medulla. The medulla is the innermost. And there's cells in there called pheochromocytes, and they produce epinephrine and norepinephrine. And when they produce those there and release them into the circulation, they act as hormones. But we also know that epinephrine and norepinephrine act as neurotransmitters, particularly associated with the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. So during a fight or flight response, the hypothalamus is going to signal sympathetic activity. And amongst the other hormonal responses that we know happen with our stress response, the epinephrine and norepinephrine that's traveled through the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system signal the adrenal medulla to release epinephrine and norepinephrine as hormones. So if we know that during fight or flight, the heart rate goes up and the respiratory rates go up and the pupils dilate and blood is redirected to the organs and tissues that need it to support fight or flight through nervous stimulation, then it's going to be supported through endocrine stimulation as well, because the same messengers will respond to the same receptors in the same way. Right? But the nervous system acts at the speed of electricity, electrical chemical exchange, right, at the synapses. So it's very quick. It tends to be short-lived. But the endocrine system is a little slower to respond, but longer lasting. So in your medical emergencies or your stressful scenarios, the nervous system initiates the response and the endocrine system can sustain it. So that's the adrenal medulla. That's where that comes into play there. But we're talking here about hormones that are associated with the adrenal cortex. So we're looking at adrenal cortical hormones. And those are generalized as the mineralocorticoids, the glucocorticoid, and the androgens. We're not going to talk too much about the androgens in this course. Again, somebody might have a chemical messenger topic that includes the androgens, and that's a different story. That will be an interesting presentation, I'm sure. But when we look at mineralocorticoids, what do you think they are going to target? What do you think they're going to have an influence over?
Minerals.
Minerals. Anyone in particular? That's kind of an important one, right? Sodium. And if we influence sodium, what do we know we're also going to influence? In the interest of
Calcium. Sorry, chloride.
okay, chloride works. So if we influence sodium, chloride is going to be affected because we're trying to maintain electrochemical balances. And also,
It's water.
not when we're talking about a mineral corticoid, potassium. I think most of us have heard of the sodium-potassium pump. Every cell in the body has large numbers of sodium-potassium pumps designed to keep potassium ultimately in the cell to a greater degree than sodium, but more sodium out than in, so that we create a polarity across that plasma membrane of all the cells in the body. Does that sound familiar?
Just a little bit.
I hope. So if we kick sodium in one direction, we're typically going to see potassium come back in the opposite direction, right? And chloride is going to probably go in the same direction as sodium, again, to keep that electrochemical charge at an equilibrium of some sort. So again, when we talk about deficiencies, talking about adrenocortical then really what we're talking about, there's primary condition. So where, and it's got it, guys, these ones associated with the, other than the thyroid, we had Graves' disease, but for whatever reason, the adrenal gland pathologies have kept some of their proper names, which are not very helpful. So I'm less concerned with you memorizing those particular names. If I talk about Addison's disease, I'll let you know that it's referring to an adrenocortical deficiency. So that one or the other would be in brackets. But if it's primary, we know it's a problem with the adrenal cortex itself. If it's secondary, we're going to go backwards. So if it's secondary, we would go hypothalamus, anterior pituitary gland, adrenal gland. Okay, and in the adrenal gland, the major mineralocorticoid, anybody know what it is? What's the major mineralocorticoid? Has an influence on these three electrolytes. The major glucocorticoid, which is going to have something to do with what?
Glucose.
Glucose.
Like glucose, right? So we got cortisol. And that's a major category of those glucocorticoids. So the mineralocorticoids are a group of hormones, the largest of which is aldosterone. And the glucocorticoids are a group of hormones. The largest representation is cortisol. Androgens, we're not going to talk too much about, but remember, hypothalamus, anterior pituitary, and adrenal gland. So going backwards, ACTH, corticotropin releasing hormone. So the corticotropin releasing hormone produced in the hypothalamus, circulatory system, to the anterior pituitary gland. Cells in the anterior pituitary gland will be stimulated to produce ACTH. ACTH into the circulation to the adrenal gland, adrenocorticotropin, ACTH. or adrenocorticotropic hormone, for all those letters, stimulates the adrenal gland to mostly affect cortisol levels. Small effect on aldosterone, but mostly this pathway that we're just drawing out here has a more direct effect on the corticoids, on the cortisone pathway. So if we're talking about a decrease in corticosteroids, these hormones are all steroid hormones. So we're really having a discussion now about cortisol. These are the toughest ones to overcome because we can appreciate that we've talked about cortisol before, right? Cortisol is the stress hormone. So if we don't have enough levels of cortisol, we don't get an effective stress response. If we don't get an effective stress response, we can't deal with fight or flight. So this is a difficult diagnosis and treatment. But just the same is important, very, very important. So we can have lots of different causes. We know that some autoimmune mechanisms contribute to this deficiency. So we're talking about a deficiency, okay? And we also know that there are some idiopathic etiologies, the ones we just don't know why they develop. Trauma to the adrenal gland. If you have it, you know, sometimes if there's kidney damage and there's a surgical removal of the kidney, especially back in the day, then the adrenal gland would be removed as well. But the most common cause, anybody know what the most common cause of prolonged deficiency in the corticosteroids is? The most common cause is from medications. Cortisol or cortisone-based, corticosteroid-based medications. Anti-inflammatories, anti-immune properties are beneficial for certain conditions, but they become detrimental when they're administered for too long a time or in too concentrated a location. So for the very reasons we know, if we remember when we talked about cortisol back in test 1 days, we knew that it promotes protein breakdown, for example, and it is also an anti-inflammatory. So with those two factors alone, there's a chance that we're going to have a delayed immune response. There's a chance that we're not going to have effective repair, osteoporosis, muscle weakness, all those factors. Remember, we talked about the triad, that unhappy triad that was associated with stress, where we had immune hyperplasia, but we had we had adrenal hyperplasia in response to the ineffective cortisone production. We're trying to make the gland tries to grow to fix the problem, but at the same time we get the deficiencies in the immune system, and that can lead to GI disturbances, right? Acid-base balance, ulcers. So we're talking about the same sort of thing happening with prolonged corticosteroid use or abuse, but not in this case from natural levels. So basically the concept here is if you're taking a form of cortisone in a medication, your natural pathway that we've drawn in here, our natural pathway is going to shut down. Why should we make cortisol or cortisone if it's already being delivered in the body? So the result is technically we've created a hypoadrenal situation because of the administration of an external form of that hormone. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So the issue that we're going to talk about is mostly from a decreased level of available cortisol, and to a much lesser degree, low levels of aldosterone. So we know that cortisol is another hormone that promotes gluconeogenesis and raises blood glucose levels. So in the absence of it, we may have a problem with reduced blood glucose concentrations. We know that we're going to have a decrease in the stress response. And with the decrease in the stress response, we may see some a decrease in vascular tone. This is a little more aldosterone related, but still, and decrease in aldosterone tone, decrease in blood volume, which is also aldosterone related. We'll talk about that in just a second. Which is going to lead to a decrease in cardiac output. And that, if it becomes significant, could become life-threatening. So we're going to see electrolyte imbalances because of the mineralocorticoid involvement. We see glucose balances because of the glucocorticoid involvement. And if it's a primary condition, what's going to happen to ACTH? If it's a primary problem, do we see elevated ACTH or decreased ACTH?
Increased.
Yeah, it would be increased. Now, here's a little interesting little twist on that. When ACTH levels are elevated, they target melanocyte. They promote melanocyte stimulating hormone. So when you promote melanocyte stimulating hormone, you're going to make more melanin. And that means we're going to get hyper pigmentation. Okay, so, and these sorts of changes are going to lead us to more long-term problems. We're going to get GI abnormalities because of the electrolyte imbalances. That's maybe going to make us feel nauseous and vomit, probably diarrhea, dehydration, tachycardia. Tachycardia because of the compensation for the decrease in cardiac output. What's our treatment plan? Replacement. Okay, now, hypercortisolism, too much. Let's give ourselves a brand new board for this. Hyper So the most common source, or the most common etiology is iatrogenic. So that's what we were talking about before, by administering high levels of cortisone from an external source of some sort. So the issue here, you can also have what's called an ectopic tumor, a tumor in another organ somewhere else in the body that starts to produce ACTH. There's a type of lung tumor that produces ACTH, so it's going to stimulate the adrenal gland to start producing excessive levels of cortisone and to a lesser degree the aldosterone. But Cushing's disease So when I talked, so I think I might be mixing you up a little bit. I'm just thinking out loud here. So when we talk about administering cortisone type treatments and creating hypocortisolism, it's because the elevated levels of cortisone will inhibit ACTH. And then the ACTH signal to the adrenal gland is going to be reduced. So we get a sort of secondary type of hypocortisolism because of the cortisone therapy. In this situation, when we say hypercortisolism is caused iatrogenically, because now we've got elevated levels, overall levels are elevated. Okay, so we can have a scenario where there is a tumor that produces elevated levels of ACTH, signals the adrenal gland to produce more cortisone, or we could have a tumor in the adrenal gland itself of the cells that produce the cortisone, promoting an increased level of, in either case, we're getting elevated levels of the cortisone and creating hypercortisolism. So Cushing's syndrome, you can imagine that this guy's going to get Cushing's disease and Cushing's syndrome after his name. So he was a primary researcher in endocrinology, one of the early researchers, I'm going to say in the 1930s, 1940s. Guy was a bit of a genius in terms of being able to illustrate and identify pathologies associated with the endocrine system, particularly with the adrenal gland. So basically, when we put syndrome after his name, it's the common signs and symptoms regardless of cause. So in other words, it's hypercortisolism, never mind whether it's primary or secondary. Cushing's disease is actually associated with secondary hypercortisolism. In other words, it's a pituitary issue. So Cushing's syndrome is because of elevated levels of cortisol for any reason. Cushing's disease is from a pathology most commonly associated with the anterior pituitary gland, but technically could be part of the hypothalamus as well to be considered. We're just talking about the difference in etiology. Our primary would most commonly come from what's called an adrenal adenoma, in other words, a tumor of the adrenal gland. In Cushing's disease, what we've got is a situation where the anterior pituitary gland is producing too much ACTH. So now we're going to get a very predictable sort of presentation. Then, like you've seen sometimes patients who are on anti-immune medication, cortisone-based anti-immune medications, get very puffy. They get that moon face. And they're flushed, they're red. And a lot of that has to do with the electrolyte adjustments that are being made create fluid shifts. And so there's a lot of edema and systemic sort of edema. They get weight gain, but specifically targeted at the abdomen. So they get very thick through the trunk. They sometimes develop what's called a buffalo hump. So that's a raised area of fatty tissue over the cervical thoracic junction area, kind of right between the shoulder blades at the base of the neck. And it's an abnormal adipose deposition there. I don't know if you've heard of this term before, hirsutism, which is excessive hair growth, and that's more of the androgens being targeted by ACTH. So you get extra hair growth. Women might develop a bit of a mustache and a little bit of fuzz at the angle of the jaw. Looks like they're growing a bit of a beard. Healing is going to be delayed. The skin is fragile. There's some purple, reddish purple streaking that sort of appears through the skin. Muscle wasting and weakness. Again, these are electrolyte imbalances that set up a lot of this stuff. Osteoporosis. We know that elevated levels of cortisone are catabolic in nature. We get decreased protein synthesis. We get increased gluconeogenesis. Those go hand in hand because if we're breaking down proteins, we make amino acids available for gluconeogenesis. We get increased insulin resistance. So again, last week we talked about insulin, and insulin is the only hormone that significantly lowers blood glucose levels. I put that word significantly in there because somatostatin, which is antagonistic to growth hormone, by definition will lower blood glucose levels, but it's not a very effective mechanism for lowering blood glucose levels. Today we talked about growth hormone resulting in hyperglycemia, excessive levels especially. We talked about the thyroid hormones promoting hyperglycemia. We've talked now about cortisol promoting hyperglycemia. We know glucagon, the antagonist to insulin, promotes hyperglycemia. So we can talk about probably a dozen hormones that raise blood glucose levels. Because if you know the primary, cortisol raises blood glucose, then ACTH raises blood glucose. And corticotropin releasing hormone raises blood glucose because we just go backwards in that path. Those hormones, now we're up to 3. In the thyroid pathway, T3, T4, TSH, and TRH. That makes 6. Growth hormone, growth releasing hormone. Now we're at 8. Glucagon is 9. Epinephrine, norepinephrine, 10 and 11. So there we are. We got a dozen hormones that raise blood glucose against one that can lower it. So it's pretty clear to see that if we mess around with insulin, we lose homeostasis of glucose. So that's when it becomes so significant. There isn't a backup. All these hormones here that are hyperglycemic have backups for maintaining blood glucose. And the whole idea here, the whole message really, is to recognize that it must be more important for our body systems to have enough glucose in the system, hyper, than not enough, right? Because we've got this dozen hormones that are going to make sure that blood glucose is maintained in the circulation, and only one that can actually reduce it. So which is more important? We obviously got to deliver glucose, particularly to the nervous system, because it's independent of insulin. And when we bring insulin into the picture, insulin does help with the utilization of glucose for the adipose cells and the muscle cells, right? So it's important for utilization, but in terms of circulating glucose in the blood, we recognize it's got to be way more important to make sure we have enough circulating. And that's really directed towards the nervous system. You follow me with that? You follow me okay with that?
Yep.
Yes.
So before we leave hypercortisolism, we know that aldosterone is going to be affected, probably not as significantly, but just the same. And if aldosterone levels are also elevated, then we're going to have more sodium being reabsorbed at the kidneys and more potassium being lost at the kidneys. And when we lose potassium at the kidneys, we get a shift in extracellular fluid from the intracellular fluid to the extracellular fluid. And the hydrogen ions typically have an exchange pathway with potassium. So the hydrogen ion, as potassium leaves the cell, the hydrogen ion goes into the cell, and it creates a metabolic alkalosis in the blood. So prolonged levels of aldosterone and cortisol are going to create a metabolic alkalosis problem. And with the increased sodium, somebody mentioned it earlier, if we increase reabsorption of sodium, what follows sodium?
Water.
Water, right? So it's important to recognize that the effects of aldosterone are not directly on the water. They're on the electrolytes, and water will follow the solute. So it directly affects sodium reabsorption. So we're going to get water following because of that. Okay, so just like we had a thyroid storm, you can have what's called an adrenal crisis. So this is going to happen when your exogenous cortisol, the cortisol medication you've been taking for months and months and months, is stopped. The adrenal gland cannot meet the demand of a stress. Now, it will eventually, but if you've removed the cortisol as a treatment and you haven't given the adrenal gland time to rebound, time to correct itself based on negative feedback loops, then you're running a period of time there where you're not going to get proper meeting of demands, not getting a proper stress response. And that could be life-threatening. That could result in a shock leading to death. Do we follow that one okay?
Yes.
Okay, so those ones, all those ones that we just talked about today are ones that follow the hypothalamic anterior pituitary to a target gland pathway, right? So those ones we can describe as being a primary problem or a secondary problem based on that pathway and our understanding of that pathway. And we know that the communication between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. So here's our hypothalamus, and then there's that hypothalamic pituitary stalk. And it was connected to the pituitary gland, anterior lobe, posterior lobe. And the communication between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary gland is a vascular one. So those stimulating factors or hormones and those inhibiting factors and hormones are released from the hypothalamus to create action on the anterior pituitary gland. But neurons in the hypothalamus also communicate with the posterior pituitary gland. But the neurons that communicate with the posterior pituitary gland do it through axons. And in the axon ending, instead of a neurotransmitter, we've got a hormone. Oxytocin. And the other one is antidiuretic hormone, also known as vasopressin. Now, both names are good names because both names tell you something about that particular hormone, about its function. Antidiuretic. What's a diuretic? You guys are in pharmacology. What are the diuretic medications supposed to do?
Make you pee.
Yeah, make you pee. So if it's an antidiuretic, it's going to stop you from peeing. In other words, you're going to retain fluid. Now, vasopressin also tells you something that this hormone is known to do, which is to promote vasoconstriction of blood vessels. And when we look at the pathway for this hormone, we'll see where that makes pretty good sense. Okay, so in the hypothalamus, we've got specialized neurons called osmoreceptors. So osmoreceptors they're going to be sensitive to what?
Water.
Well, concentrations in the water, that's what Osmo is telling us, right? So basically what we're saying here is that we can have scenarios where we have decreased dehydration. Or, you guys know this from your self-study on water balances. Right? Both of those are going to be registered by osmoreceptors as a problem. Dehydration or hyperosmolarity. You could have water loss or you could have electrolyte gain. In either case, the osmoreceptors are going to get excited about that and say, we have to make a change. We have to do something. We have to fix this. Does that make sense? We okay with what we're talking about here?
Yes.
Okay. So the goal then in this, so that our stimulus is dehydration. The hypothalamus is going to produce and release ADH. And ADH targets aquaporins in the distal convoluted tubules of the kidney. And I know you all remember all about proximal and distal convoluted tubules and the collecting ducts. Now, what do you think an aquaporin is? What's an aquaporin?
Moves water.
Well, moves water, is that what you said?
Or allows water to move.
Yeah, because it's what? It's a water pore, right? It's going to be a transmembranous protein that is closed unless it gets targeted by ADH. Now, when ADH targets the aquaporin, we're going to get an opening up of water pores, and we're going to be able to increase reabsorption of water. Look what our stimulus was. Loss of water, relative loss of water. The correction is to increase the reabsorption of water. And we do that by upregulating these receptors for ADH. So not only does ADH bind to the aquaporin, open it up, but it stimulates upregulation of those aquapores. So we're going to insert additional water pores and promote reabsorption of water. And when we reabsorb water, we're going to increase blood pressure, right? Because we increase water volume, we're going to increase blood volume. And if so, in the other stimulus then for ADH would be a decrease in blood pressure, which is what's going to happen in dehydration anyway. So in either case, we've addressed the stimulus, we've reversed the stimulus. In this case, by primarily targeting the movement of water. For that person earlier today, it was thought when we were talking about the electrolytes, right? Testosterone works primarily on the electrolytes and water follows. In this case, ADH is working directly on water. So we're going to have two mechanisms that can raise blood pressure. ADH can raise blood pressure in this pathway, and aldosterone can raise it by promoting reabsorption of sodium. Also, both of them are both happening in the kidney. Different areas of the kidney, different parts of the tubule, but not even in some cases, distal convoluted tubule too, overlaps for both. But if we're interested in increasing blood pressure, it also makes sense that we would put some vasoconstriction on blood vessels. That will also raise blood pressure. So if we're trying to prevent shock, we've got multiple pathways. Just like we have multiple pathways for hyperglycemia, we got multiple pathways to try to prevent a significant drop in blood pressure. Aldosterone, the renin-angiotensin pathway, and this ADH pathway. So the pathology is called diabetes insipidus. Diabetes insipidus, actually, I think most of the time nowadays, they don't do the British. They just do the American. Insipidus is where you're going to see it most often. So this is a problem with the amounts of ADH that are available. Decreased ADH. So it's an ADH deficiency. And the primary symptom is going to be polyuria, which is where the diabetes terminology comes from. Now, this type of polyuria is not because of hyperglycemia. Remember, we talked about the polyuria that occurred because of the glucose overwhelming the glomerular filtration capacity for reabsorbing glucose. As a result, glucose spills into the urine. It's a solute, water follows, you fill bladder, you pee, polyuria. In this case, the polyuria is because ADH isn't responsive. And so we're going to get polyuria because normally ADH gets released in small amounts over a daytime period of time to concentrate the urine so that we don't eliminate all the water that gets filtered at the kidney. So it might be from a problem with the hypothalamus, trauma, tumor, affects the cells in that area, that sort of thing. Some drugs, particularly alcohol, will decrease ADH secretion. We know that caffeine has an indirect effect on ADH. You know, if you drink lots of coffee, you got to go to the bathroom more often. You know, if you drink lots of alcohol, you got to go to the bathroom more often. Cold weather inhibits ADH. Typically, you have to go to the bathroom more in cold weather. So normal ADH levels result in 1 to 2 liters a day of urine. Does that sound about right?
Sure.
Oh boy, like I thought that was a gimme. Oh boy. There's some values that you should just have a handle on. And, you know, having an idea that we urinate somewhere between 1 and 2 liters a day is kind of an important physiological value, because if we have too much more than that, we become dehydrated. And if we have a lot less than that, then we may have other filtering issues at the kidney. So, you know, I thought that would be a gimme. I know we talk about it in the digestive system and the urinary system. And we talked about it in the endocrine system when we covered this in HAP 101. The other ones were in HAP 201. So basically, under normal conditions, low levels or normal levels of ADH are going to give us 1 to 2 liters of urine. So if we have abnormal low levels of ADH, we end up with the polyuria, and polydipsia is not enough. Because what we're talking about in somebody that has the absence of or significantly reduced ADH is probably the losses in the range of 15 to 20 liters. So the urine becomes very dilute, and you're talking about anywhere from a 10 to 20-fold increase in water loss. Most of us cannot drink 15 to 20 liters of replacement fluid on a regular basis. And so this becomes a pathology. The result is this individual is going to become dehydrated. And the difference with diabetes insipidus is there's no glucose in the urine. So you might see the polyuria and the polydipsia and think, oh, this person has diabetes. You're thinking mellitus because it's far more common. But if the urine is tested and there's no glucose in it, you're talking about this type, very likely at least. So basically, there may be some other presentations that help you out: dry mucus membranes, decreased saliva and sweat, lethargy, the loss of volume may lead to seizures and that sort of thing, but that also could be seen in diabetes mellitus as well. So the treatment for people that have deficient levels of ADH is replacement, and the primary source of replacement is the nasal spray. And then rehydration, usually a little more attention to their hydration status to prevent sort of crisis type scenarios. So that's what's happening in a deficiency. You can get a type of tumor, another type of ectopic tumor from another place, not the hypothalamus, in other words. Again, some types of lung cancer. We mentioned it for ACTH, and this is another example of a type of lung cancer where there are elevated levels of ADH. In this case, there'll be an excessive amount of reabsorption of water, so the individual would become hyponatremic because the extra water would dilute the osmolarity. The urine would be very concentrated and would probably drop to less than half a liter per day being eliminated. Muscle cramping, nausea, vomiting would be some of the presentation. So the treatment is diuretic treatment and decreased fluid intake in this type of situation. Really, really rare. Really rare. But most of these endocrine pathologies are rare pathologies. Graves' disease is common. Diabetes mellitus is obviously quite common, relatively speaking.